Some lives look seamless until the smallest question pulls a thread, and that is where curiosity becomes danger. The mind wants coherence, the heart wants reassurance, and yet the first crack in a perfect story calls to both like a whisper, behind a door you should not open. In Cambridge, where stone courts keep their own counsel and clocks mark diligence as a kind of devotion. A graduate student accepted what seemed an honorable task to write the biography of a celebrated mathematician whose work had long outlived the man. It was the kind of assignment that promises prestige without risk, a straightforward stitching of fact to legacy. Yet the opening chapters resisted, and resistance has a psychology of its own. Dates blurred when they ought to align, letters referred to conversations no one recalled, and the mathematician's colleagues spoke with a strange mixture of pride and careful omission, as if the most interesting parts of the story were the ones they could not quite bring themselves to say. Into this polite confusion moved Imogen Quay, a nurse at the college with the quiet authority of someone who sees daily truths in unguarded moments. She did not carry a badge. She made no claims to authority beyond the clean discipline of attention, but attention, when applied with patience, is a tool sharper than suspicion. She noticed how a name appeared and disappeared across catalogs, how a single photograph had been reproduced so often that it had become a stand-in for a whole life, how memories grew too polished the more they were repeated, where others felt comfort in a smooth narrative. She felt the heat of friction. The graduate student, earnest and dutiful, had begun the work in the usual way: archives, interviews, bibliographies, a map of influences and achievements. Yet the map refused to match the terrain. A conference date overlapped with a hospital stay that no one could verify. A sabbatical letter praised a breakthrough that later papers never mentioned. A praise-heavy obituary left out an early mentor who, in informal recollection, had apparently mattered more than any. The problem was not a lack of data, but an excess that did not cohere, like a proof that dazzles line by line and still fails to arrive at the promised conclusion. Imogen's gift was to treat those discrepancies not as irritations but as signals. People lie to protect reputation, but they also misremember to protect identity. And in academic rooms where pride is wrapped in civility, omissions can masquerade as good manners. She began, as she always did, by attending to the ordinary. She watched who hesitated before answering a simple question. She listened to the drift of tone when the mathematician's name arose. A half-second of softness here, a brittle joke there, the way one colleague flattened adjectives while another inflated them beyond usefulness. She visited the small places where the grand narrative rarely checks for accuracy, the caretaker's logbooks, the student newsletters, the dusty shelf where a retired secretary kept a habit of storing extra copies of old memos because no one ever asked for them, and yet the habit felt like a duty. The more she looked, the more the past behaved like a room rearranged in the dark. Nothing vanished, but what belonged where had been altered just enough to change the sense of the whole. The graduate student felt it too, that unease that comes when a project refuses to be only a project. What should have been a chronological ascent now felt like a climb up a staircase that turns when you least expect it, each landing revealing a wall where the blueprint shows a window. Anxiety sharpened curiosity. Curiosity, once sharpened, asks better questions. Why did a brilliant mind leave so few personal traces? Why did the most meticulous years produce the vaguest records? Why did those who owed their careers to this mathematician radiate admiration while stepping around specifics with the grace of dancers, avoiding a broken tile on a polished floor Imogen did not accuse? Accusation closes doors, and a closed door, in Cambridge, can remain closed for a very long time. Instead, she nudged the story forward by allowing silence to do some of the work. In a world addicted to explanation, silence unsettles, and unsettled people reveal more than they intend. A paused breath before a date. A glance toward a filing cabinet no one had mentioned. A phrase repeated in precisely the same way by two people who insisted they had never discussed the matter. She filed each detail as a nurse files symptoms, not as proof, but as pattern. The mathematician's public genius was easy to praise. The private life kept receding just when it should have come into focus. Even the artifacts felt curated, as if someone had arranged the display to be admired instead of examined. The graduate student began to feel watched by the material, as though the archive itself disliked her touch. That is the psychology of fragile legacies. They invite celebration while resisting inquiry. Yet inquiry, once started, exerts its own gravity. Imogen understood that the risk was not a dramatic confrontation, but a quiet accumulation of small truths that, assembled, could threaten reputations built over decades. In that tension between the safety of a good story and the peril of the true one, the mystery found its charge. What if the mathematician's greatest theorem was not on paper, but in the careful construction of a life that would survive question after question without ever yielding its center? And what kind of past requires that kind of architecture? Imogen, attuned to the ethics beneath the evidence, followed the feeling that something vital had been moved, not destroyed, the kind of alteration that leaves a faint outline if you know where to look. She kept looking. Patterns announce themselves only to the patient, and patience is the one luxury that turns confusion into outline. Imogen returned to the small rooms of evidence where no one bothers to tidy the past for visitors and let repetition teach her what intent tried to hide. In the porter's lodge she found the long book of routine, a column for deliveries, a column for repairs, a column for messages not urgent enough to be called messages, and noted how several tidy corrections appeared across different weeks in the same compact hand. She compared those dates with the graduate student's expanding timeline and saw that small adjustments had been made not to clarify but to blur. Pulling a day forward here, nudging a week back there, the sort of changes that do not matter individually and matter very much when arranged in sequence. In the library, a set of index cards exhaled the dust of long sleep, and on the back of one, a faint pencil triangle marked a reference to a personal letter said to be on file, except that the file now held only a space, and the feeling of something once kept. The graduate student, conscientious and hopeful, continued to visit those who had known the mathematician and returned each time with the same alloy of admiration and vagueness. People liked to recall excellence in outlines. They spoke of brilliance without examples, generosity without specifics, and when pressed for texture, their recollections folded into courteous generalities. Imogen understood that this was not a conspiracy so much as a culture, a shared instinct to maintain the integrity of a story that had done good work for the college and for the teller's sense of having lived near something rare. She let that instinct stand without challenging it and attended to what it tried to smooth. An early paper cited a funding source that later notices ignored. A celebrated lecture traveled through retellings until the date no longer matched the conference that had supposedly hosted it. A student magazine printed an anecdote that, read against the day book of the same week, could not have happened in the manner described. None of these facts accused anyone of anything. Together they functioned like the faint graphite of a preliminary sketch beneath the oil paint of an official portrait. The psychology of it interested her more than the scandal others expected. Greatness breeds the need for stable narrative. Stable narrative breeds edits to what resists neatness. Edits accumulate until you cannot tell whether you are protecting a legacy or protecting yourself from the discomfort of fragments that do not fit. Imogen's nursing taught her to translate fragments into care, and care begins with accurate notes. She drew a clean line across a large sheet and built a private chronology no one had asked her to build, a spine to hold the pieces the graduate student kept bringing in. When the line reached the period that had already begun to feel charged, there was a pause in the record that official accounts tried to rush past. A cluster of references pointed toward a brief absence with no consistent reason attached. In oral histories, it was travel. In a colleague's notebook, it was an illness. In a departmental memo, it was marked as leave with no cause given. The absence itself was not unusual. What drew her attention was how meticulously later narrators hurried over it, as if explanation would lead to further questions, and those questions would not stop where manners do. She sought peripheral witnesses, not to trap anyone, but to let the edges sharpen the center. The caretaker remembered a window repaired in rooms that should have been empty. A retired secretary remembered a set of proofs collected by someone other than their author. A senior academic, courteous to a fault, preferred to discuss the mathematician's influence rather than the mathematician's person, and in that preference lay a small confession that sympathy had limits. The graduate student, sensing the current against which the project now swam, received a formal letter withdrawing access to a private collection that had previously been offered without condition. The explanation focused on preservation and cataloging pressures. The effect was a locked door. Imogen did not argue with the lock. She returned instead to what remained public and noticed how often the mathematician's image appeared in the same photograph. A single portrait used as universal shorthand, reproduced in programs, framed in halls, reprinted in memorial texts. She studied the print itself and found it too perfect. A face presented without the minor defacements, time grants even to the most careful lives. A life with one reliable picture suggested either shyness or selection, and selection implied a curator. She began to look for the curator without naming one. That search uncovered the odd comfort of forgotten ephemera. In a college newsletter from years before, the mathematician's renown hardened into the seasonless marble of reputation. A paragraph described a seminar in which the speaker was introduced by someone nearly omitted from later accounts. The paragraph mentioned a dedication written on the first page of an early draft. A dedication that, in published form, had become merely initials. Imogen did not leap to conclusions. She placed the early mention beside the later version and let the space between them do its slow work. In that space, the mathematics remained untouched. But the story of the person who made it shifted from singular ascent to something more networked, more indebted, more human than the sleek memorials allowed. She could feel the graduate student's fatigue, that weary mixture of responsibility and shrinking room to move, and she answered it with what she could provide, a method that turned weariness back into focus. If several small truths had been moved, then the goal was not to denounce the moving, but to restore the shape that movement had obscured. A life can be arranged to protect the right to be admired. A biography can be steered to protect the right to admire without effort. The gentlest correction is to ask again and again where exactly this thing happened, who else was present, what paper trail verifies the memory, and why this absence has earned so much quiet industry. She looked at the timeline she had built and saw one more feature that had been hiding in plain sight. In the season after the unaccounted weeks, the mathematician's public tone altered, warmer in acknowledgments, cooler in interviews, as if some private negotiation had settled something and left a permanent seam. Seams do not ruin fabric, they reveal the shape of what was made. Imogen traced the seam with her attention and prepared to follow it wherever it led. The seam did not point like an arrow, it tugged like a loose thread, asking to be followed without promising where it would lead. Imogen began with tone because tone is a kind of fingerprint. Before the unaccounted weeks, the mathematician's acknowledgments were succinct and solitary, a habit of thanking institutions rather than people. Afterward, the language softened, a subtle widening that allowed for gratitude toward unnamed colleagues and an occasional nod to guidance received off the page. That change could be maturation or courtesy, yet in a mind praised for precision, change without cause deserved attention. She aligned the shift with conference programs, with the rhythm of publication cycles, with the tidy corrections in the lodge book, and felt the outline of another presence, not a ghost, but a hand that had pressed gently at the edges of the story until those edges held a new shape. Influence leaves residue. Imogen looked for the kind that resists cataloging. She revisited the college newsletters, not for grand announcements, but for the interval pieces that fill the space between achievements. A report of a colloquium listed a last-minute chair for the event, the same nearly omitted name that had surfaced in the early paragraph about the seminar dedication. Minutes from a committee meeting recorded an apology for absence by the mathematician, along with an attached note from a colleague vouching for an unavoidable commitment. The note was preserved not as content, but as metadata, a one-line mention that pointed to a piece of paper long gone. What remained was the pattern of vouching, a small habit of providing cover that, seen once, might be courtesy and, seen repeatedly, suggested a quiet arrangement of care. The graduate student labored under new constraints that felt old in the way of institutional memory. Appointments were rescheduled with kindness that was hard to challenge. Keys that once opened a particular cabinet were now said to be awaiting replacement. Offers to help arrived paired with gentle reminders to avoid overburdening those who had already contributed. None of it rose to the level of obstruction. Yet the cumulative effect was a corridor where the lights were always on, but somehow never bright enough. Imogen knew that anxiety feeds on vague resistance, so she gave the student something actionable build from the periphery inward. If the central documents receded, let the context grow so robust that absence would stand out as deficit rather than mystery. Context, like a scaffolding, allows the structure to reveal where support has been added and why. Peripheral witnesses continued to yield details that did not strike them as details. A part-time archivist recalled a donation of personal papers from a colleague years after the mathematician's death, boxed with an efficiency that felt less like sorting and more like sealing. The label on the box used a shorthand found nowhere else, as if the person who wrote it had a separate system and briefly forgot to translate for future readers. A printer's invoice recorded a rush job for memorial programs, printed from a photograph that arrived with an instruction to crop a fraction more closely than the version now framed in the hall. That instruction, separated by time from the image it shaped, drifted back with the suggestion of curation that wished to remove not a person, but a context behind a shoulder, an object on a table, a background element that had once mattered. Imogen returned to the retired secretary's habitually overstocked drawer. Beneath the layered years of spare memo pads and paperclip tins, there lay a thin folder of carbon copies, kept for no reason the secretary could justify beyond the feeling that one day someone would be grateful. Imogen was grateful. The copies were faint and stubborn to read, yet their legitimacy came from their lowliness. Among them was a short note scheduling a meeting at a precise hour of the morning with the mathematician and the nearly omitted colleague in a room that official records declared under renovation at that time. Renovations had their own paper trail. They could not be bent by memory in the way that feelings could, by aligning the renovation schedule with the note and with the porter's corrections. Imogen saw the contour of those unaccounted weeks sharpen. The room had been unavailable, the meeting had been moved, and the movement had placed people together who, in memorial narratives, preferred to be adjacent rather than overlapping. She thought about the psychology of adjacency, how institutions protect themselves by keeping complex truths at the edges of what is celebrated. It is safer for a legend to be composed of singularities than of entanglements. Singularities concede nothing to the fragile fact that minds grow in relation to other minds, that influence can be both mentorship and negotiation, that a life's clean lines are sometimes drawn around corners where difficult agreements live. What the seam suggested was not disgrace, but dependence, not fraud, but a kind of editorial companionship that had never been openly claimed. If that companionship had remained invisible, someone had made it so, and someone else had benefited from the invisibility. A biography that insists on solitary origins invites reverence without responsibility. A corrective that names collaboration demands the humility to admit that genius, too, has a social life. The graduate student, renewed by the solidity of these edges, began to write sentences that did not accuse, yet refused to flatten. Each sentence was a small test of the system that preferred smoothness. Early drafts described the mathematician's silence about certain periods as characteristic reticence. Revised drafts contextualized that reticence within a history of mediated communication, of notes relayed, of lectures introduced by a colleague who appeared wherever records grew thin. In sharing those drafts with potential interviewees, the student noticed a change. Some who had spoken easily before now asked to see the outline first. Others, surprisingly, offered specifics as if relieved by the prospect of a narrative spacious enough to hold complexity without assigning blame. The photograph remained a quiet irritant. Imogen requested access to the original negative and was told that such matters were handled off-site by a firm that managed the college's visual archive. Off-site was a softer way of saying not here, and not here can stretch into not ever. She returned instead to copies made nearest to the time of the event and compared margins across printings. In the earliest version, a sliver of a second shoulder could be seen at the edge, too indistinct to identify yet particular enough to indicate proximity. Later versions had tightened the crop just past that sliver. The change proved nothing except intention. Intention, however slight, accumulates meaning when paired with other small movements that lean in the same direction. Imogen understood the risk of narrative momentum, how easy it is to turn accumulation into accusation. She kept to the discipline that had brought her here, separate what is felt from what is shown. Let what is shown earn the right to be felt. The seam remained a seam, not a verdict. The next step was to discover whether the nearly omitted colleague had left traces that could be recovered without forcing a revelation no one had consented to give. Traces preferred to be found rather than dragged into light. She prepared to search the places where people store their careful versions of the truth acknowledgments that can be read two ways: minor donations to minor collections, the footnotes tucked into talks that no one thought to transcribe because brilliance was expected to be the only record worth keeping. Traces favor patience over force. So Imogen began with the smallest of invitations acknowledgments that hid in plain sight, where gratitude could be a cipher if read with care, and only gratitude if taken at face value. She lined them up across years and noticed a rhythm to the thanks, a cadence that repeated unnamed assistance at moments when the mathematics took a sudden clarifying turn, and where a named institution appeared, the same name sat just beyond it in other documents, present in minutes and printer's notes, absent in speeches, the kind of presence that leaves fingerprints on logistics rather than on laurels. She followed that logistical dust through donation registers that would bore anyone not committed to the art of inference, and through the ledgers of small grants approved at precise hours of the morning when committees tend to be most businesslike. And there it was again, the nearly omitted colleague authorizing a disbursement for travel that official biographies never mentioned. Travel leaves receipts even when memory refuses to, and receipts resist flattery. A modest claim for a rail ticket matched a colloquium that later accounts placed elsewhere. A hotel invoice overlapped with a week the mathematician was supposedly secluded in study, and a brief line in a porter's record referred to a visitor signed in under a spelling so idiosyncratic that it must have been supplied aloud by the visitor themselves. Idiosyncrasy defeats curation. Imogen let those edges press together until they suggested not scandal, but collaboration, not theft, but a companionship of mind that institutions value in private and minimize in public, because public stories prefer a single hero. The graduate student, steadied by these usable certainties, began to write with the humility of someone who understands that truth, presented without performance, can carry its own voltage. Sentences proposed that the mathematician's breakthroughs stood on a scaffolding of conversations, that drafts passed through another pair of eyes at hours no one thought to record because care feels unremarkable while it is happening. Predictably, kindness and resistance braided again. One reader offered dates, another withdrew consent to be quoted. A third, unexpectedly, mailed a copy of an old program annotated in the margin with the initials that had once been reduced to anonymity in print. Initials are a cautious truth, a way to speak while appearing to keep silence, and their ink, though faded, belonged to a hand that had no reason to lie to a program it never expected anyone to study decades later. Programs travel, photographs freeze. The photograph, still a problem, yielded another fraction of honesty when Imogen located a printer's proof with crop marks at an earlier tolerance. The boundary showed not a second shoulder now, but the curved edge of a chalkboard, dense with symbols that had been dissolved into background blur in the framed edition. Symbols aligned in a hand different from the mathematician's, a hand that tipped letters with a particular tilt to the right. Handwriting analysis would have been melodrama in this setting. She refused melodrama and kept to alignment. On a lecture handout preserved by chance in a personal folder. The same tilt annotated an equation with a quiet question mark, and the initials beneath that mark matched the margin of the annotated program. If the mind seeks pattern too eagerly, it invents. If it refuses pattern, it remains blind. Imogen balanced between those risks and offered the student a way to state the visible without accusing the invisible. The biography could expand its frame, not to diminish the mathematician, but to make the achievement more human, more relational, more credible to thinking people who know that genius often manifests not as isolation, but as a rare openness to correction at just the right hour of the morning in just the right room with just the right companion. That hour returned to her as she examined diaries of room bookings, the kind of dry calendar that only matters when it disagrees with a myth. For several weeks across the disputed period, a small seminar space showed a recurring entry under a project name that never appeared in publications. The entry was booked not by the mathematician, but by the nearly omitted colleague. The project name surfaced once more in a retired administrator's note about key access reissued temporarily to allow early starts due to light-dependent needs, an administrative phrase that, translated, meant someone needed a specific hour of the morning for clarity or habit or both. Routine proves more than recollection when recollection has grown ornamental. With those routines assembled, the student drafted a chapter that treated absence as structure rather than void, showing how the college's daily machinery hosted a collaboration too modest to announce itself and too essential to deny once the traces were placed side by side. The draft did not accuse anyone of concealment. It simply made a mission difficult to maintain. That difficulty changed the temperature in rooms where drafts were discussed. Resistance softened at the edges, replaced by the older, deeper relief that comes when a long-maintained effort can stop. People who had defended the smooth portrait did not confess. They merely permitted specificity. A date here was corrected. A title there was demoted from sole authorship to team effort. A foreword acquired a sentence acknowledging formative dialogue, without which a certain line of thought might not have matured as it did. This was not victory. It was care, redistributed. Imogen knew the work was fragile because fragility is the price of truth in places that confuse perfection with honor. The photograph could still be used as a shield. The single hero narrative could still comfort donors who prefer simple icons to complicated realities. Yet she also understood the psychology of thresholds. Once readers encounter a story that honors complexity without malice, they rarely return happily to the flatness of myth. The chapter, now shaped, needed one more segment to hold, a quiet center that would make the expanded frame feel inevitable rather than insurgent. She returned to the first premise of the assignment, a biography meant to honor a life by assembling the pieces that had scattered with time. Honor, she decided, is best served when the piece of justice is not punitive but precise. That is, when it gives each participant their portion of truth without dragging them to a stage they did not seek. The nearly omitted colleague deserved that portion, not as revelation, but as recognition. And the mathematician, finally, deserved a narrative strong enough to carry the whole of the work as it actually happened. Pressure seldom announces itself with drama. It arrives as courtesy that becomes instruction, as helpful suggestions that harden into limits, as invitations to postpone that begin to look like denials by another name. And in that softened weather, the graduate student felt the center of her work tilt just enough to make every sentence feel like a risk taken in polite shoes. Imogen treated the tilt as information rather than warning because fear distorts pattern, and pattern is what she needed to protect the integrity of the story that was slowly choosing to be told. She returned to the scaffolding she had built and asked whether the frame could bear one more beam, something strong enough to hold a recognition without demanding a confession. And her question led her back to the quiet roots by which people who do not wish to be visible still move the world forward with decisive kindness. A small envelope arrived at the college office addressed to the student in a tidy hand that belonged to no one on the current staff list. And inside lay a copy of a short internal circular from years ago, reproduced on thin paper that kept the ghost of the opposite side visible. And in that ghosting appeared a trace of what the official circular had obscured. A half line of an addendum that allocated time in a room for consultation on draft materials with initials that matched the margin notes already gathered from unrelated sources. The circular itself was mundane. The addendum mattered. The initials mattered only because they were consistent with a pattern, and consistency, when it accumulates quietly across independent documents, becomes a form of truth that does not need to raise its voice. The student read the circular and felt the relief of permission without authorization. The feeling that someone out there who knew more than she did wanted the record to settle closer to what actually happened. And that relief steadied her pen. Imogen, who had learned from years of nursing that gratitude can be both real and a way to stop asking questions too early, kept looking for corroboration that did not rely on private favors. She stepped back into the institutional timeline and found that the year of the unaccounted weeks also contained a reorganization of a committee responsible for research leave approvals. And in the minutes of the meeting that approved the change, a single sentence noted that several applications had been revised in light of emergent collaboration needs. A bureaucratic phrase that rewarded attention with the implication that the mathematician had not worked alone in a period the biography had previously treated as solitary brilliance. Bureaucratic implication is not narrative. She translated it into infrastructure, showing how the college itself, without trumpeting the fact, had made room for a kind of work two minds do when they are honest enough to admit that ideas improve when challenged by the right neighbor at the right table. To bring the abstraction down to a sensible floor. Imogen mapped the keycard access logs against the room booking diaries for a fortnight that sat in the middle of the disputed season and discovered that the nearly omitted colleague's card opened the same small seminar room several mornings in sequence at nearly the same hour of the morning, early enough to avoid foot traffic, yet late enough to meet the administrative phrase about light-dependent needs, and the mathematician's card appeared minutes later in a pattern that repeated with the regularity of a shared appointment that never needed to be written down because habit had replaced reminder. Habit is a form of witness when people have tried not to leave one. The student placed this pattern into prose that refused melodrama, explaining that the breakthroughs the world admired could be traced through the architecture of the college and the reinforcement of its daily systems, that a door held open at a certain time, a set of lights left on in that small room, a pile of chalk kept replenished on a side table, formed the texture of shared work even when the published page offered only one name at the top. Resistance diminished further, not because those who had preferred the cleaner portrait changed their minds about the value of myth, but because the assembled particulars required less faith than the myth did. And institutions, for all their fondness for symbolic clarity, are built to favor records that allow auditors to nod. A threshold had been reached. The story did not need anyone to admit anything. It could simply show itself. Into that slow unveiling came an unexpected kindness that did not fit any ledger and therefore mattered all the more. A small parcel was left for the student at the porter's desk, with a note that named no sender and offered only the assurance that these belonged with the account being written, and inside lay a handful of pages torn neatly from a notebook, the edges squared with care, bearing equations in a hand that tipped letters to the right, and, in the margins, a second hand that answered with comments and arrows and the soft insistence of a mind willing to be corrected by someone it trusted. There was no signature, there were no dates, yet the ink and paper matched the tools used in the period already under examination, and a faint imprint on one page reproduced the corner of a college stamp that matched the administrative stationery from the very year of the seam. Imogen handled the pages with a neutrality learned from clinical work, neither celebrating a victory nor mourning the proof that humans cannot resist leaving traces when they are truly engaged. And she advised the student to treat the pages not as revelation, but as context that finally had a face. The chapter took their shape and offered the mathematician to the reader as both singular and companioned, as a mind of extraordinary force and a person who, at crucial junctures, welcomed a second intelligence to temper test and lift the work beyond what solitary effort had reached. By making space for that companionship, the narrative did not diminish the principal figure. It rendered him more believable, more admirable, in the exact sense that adulthood admires not the fantasy of untouched genius, but the discipline of listening and the courage to change a line of thought when another hand places a quiet question mark in the right place at the right time. The remaining obstacle was publication, which in a scholarly world is less a finish line than a gauntlet of preferences carrying the weight of tradition. The student submitted the revised chapter to the series editor with a covering note that summarized the evidence without revealing any source that had requested care, and then waited as one waits for a medical result, knowing that the interpretation can be more consequential than the data themselves. Imogen, who understood waiting as part of any serious work, prepared for both outcomes by drafting the ethical argument that would sit beneath the published account if it was accepted, and by sketching a gentler, public-facing version of the same argument in case the chapter was deemed too expansive for a series that had built its audience on nationalized myths of solitary genius. Either way, the piece of justice would find its form, because work kept at the right temperature and with the right patience tends to do that. Acceptance arrived not as triumph, but as a measured door left ajar. The editor's note proposing publication provided the chapter remained anchored to verifiable particulars and trimmed of any rhetorical drift that might tempt readers to hear accusation where only context had been offered, and the graduate student reading between the courteous lines understood that the work had been recognized for its steadiness and was now being asked to prove it once more in the open. Imogen welcomed the caution. Scrutiny is not an enemy when the aim is precision. She advised treating the conditions as a final instrument check before performance, a way to confirm that each theme could carry its own weight without leaning on suggestion, and then she returned to the quiet labor of tightening connections that already existed. The last confirmations hid not in sensational caches, but in the minor public record that resists revision because it appears beneath the threshold of pride. A faded community bulletin recorded a series of lunch seminars with topics and chair names aligned to the very weeks that had grown significant. An internal guide for first-year students mentioned office hours informally kept by the nearly omitted colleague at a room and hour that matched keycard patterns, and a maintenance ticket listed a routine replacement of chalk in that same small seminar space twice as frequently during the fortnight that had already revealed its rhythm. None of this shouted. All of it agreed. Agreement built a platform from which the pros could step without wobbling. The student rebuilt the pivotal pages with shorter sentences and clearer hinges, pointing readers to the way corridors and calendars corroborate what people forget to name when ceremony dominates memory. The psychology of reception mattered now more than the psychology of concealment. Imogen thought about how audiences hear stories that confront their preference for singular heroism. Minds resist complexity when it is delivered as correction. They receive it when it is offered as enlargement. She suggested an opening paragraph that affirmed what admiration had rightfully preserved and then widened the frame to show the social architecture within which solitary brilliance becomes durable achievement. Widening is less frightening than overturning. It promises more, not less. Pressure returned in a new form, not as denial, but as concern voiced from institutional corners where risk is measured in donor comfort and reputational temperature. A letter arrived requesting reassurance that source care had been prioritized, that no private documents had been mishandled, that no individual would be identified in a manner that could invite unwanted attention. The letter read like a hedge woven for shade rather than a wall built for war. Imogen answered by translating every step of the method into procedure, documenting how dates had been triangulated from public schedules, how anonymous materials had been treated as prompts to seek independent confirmation rather than as the basis for any claim, how drafts had been moderated to remove any flourish that might be mistaken for insinuation. Procedure soothes fear because it converts intention into auditability. An anonymous complaint followed, alleging that the student's chapter risked harm by encouraging speculation. The editor forwarded it with a request for clarification, and clarification was supplied by returning to the ledger of particulars, by showing how every assertion rested on visible support while every invisibility remained unnamed and protected. The complaint dissolved into air for lack of friction. Careful work is not invulnerable, but it is difficult to wound with vague weapons. The photograph finally yielded a companion piece that steadied the narrative in a different register. An alumni magazine preserved a behind-the-scenes snapshot taken by an amateur during a memorial reception, printed once and forgotten because it was aesthetically ordinary. In the background, the framed portrait hung with the slightly tighter crop. In the foreground, a table displayed ephemera, including a contact sheet with the original print sequence, visible enough to reveal that multiple versions had been considered before settling on the now familiar image. Selecting is not a crime. Acknowledging selection makes curation honest. The student used that honesty to explain how institutions build icons for legitimate reasons, and how icons, once built, require supplemental text to prevent the quiet erasure of companions who kept the work from collapsing under the weight of legend. With structural arguments in place, the chapter moved into typesetting. Imogen anticipated the final practical question that often arrives too late to be handled gracefully: what to do with the newly surfaced notebook pages. To abandon them to private limbo would invite future misreadings. To publish them would trespass on care. She proposed a compromise that honored both truth and discretion. The pages would be deposited under restricted access in the college archive, with a note referencing their existence in neutral terms, paired with a public statement that the biography had benefited from contextual materials confirming patterns of collaboration without naming individuals beyond those already present in the record. Restriction is not secrecy when it is properly signposted. A presentation was scheduled for a modest audience of colleagues and students at a sensible hour of the afternoon, framed as a workshop on method rather than a debut of revelations. Framing influences physiology. Bodies brace against exposés and relax for craft talks. Relaxed bodies listen. Listening bodies change their minds. Imogen prepared the student for the small storms that belong to rooms where people confront adjustments to treasured narratives. There would be the question disguised as kindness that recommends further delay, the observation that mistakes can happen in archives and therefore perhaps have happened here, the elegy for simplicity masquerading as a plea for general readers who cannot be expected to follow complexity. To each, the student would offer the same ballast, the map of corridors and calendars, the ledger of maintenance and minutes, the small notes that agree though they were never asked to, the gentle assertion that writing history is an act of gratitude that becomes more credible when it includes those who held the ladder steady while another climbed. The day arrived with an uneventful morning and the kind of light that makes rooms feel fair. The talk unfolded without ornament, the evidence arranged like stepping stones across a shallow stream where listeners could see the bottom at every point. Critique came, and it was healthy. One colleague asked for a clearer distinction between inference and demonstration. The student obliged by building that distinction into the next slide and thanking the question for improving the language of the project in real time. Another asked whether readers might misuse the chapter to claim scandal. Imogen answered from the back, with the quiet authority of someone uninterested in theater, reminding the room that misuse is a risk in any publication, and that the antidote is clarity, not silence. Relief settled not as applause, but as the hum of minds that have found a shape they can carry without strain. With that hum as shelter, the typeset proof moved toward a final approval, and the task that had begun as a simple honor felt near completion, not because the conflict had been vanquished, but because the truth had been given a form that would continue to hold when memory softened again. The seam remained visible, and visibility had become its own kind of mercy. Publication settled into the world with the quiet of snow. Each flake of evidence laid where it belonged until the landscape took on a truer shape. And when the series released the chapter, the first responses arrived not as thunder, but as the soft percussion of minds changing their angle of regard. A seminar that met at Fort Urprum added the pages to its syllabus and discussed how institutions teach the art of seeing by what they choose to frame. A postgraduate reading group gathered at 10:00 mm, and marveled that a biography could feel both generous and corrective at once. And a senior scholar who had long defended the single hero portrait sent a note that read, like a person putting down a weight they did not know they were carrying. There were protests, of course, because stories people love can feel like shelters, and any widening of a shelter's walls sounds to the heart like a draft. An alumni letter worried that complexity makes admiration harder for the public. A columnist outside the college attempted to stir appetite with the suggestion of scandal where none had been offered, and an internal committee requested a retrospective review of archive access procedures as if method could be made safer than ethics. Imogen received this weather with the same calm she carried through the wards, where complaints about pain often arrive louder when healing is in progress, and she continued her small work of translating temperature into pattern. The student, now steadier in the public air than she had feared, accepted invitations to speak at 2 mem and 6 PTPs, and learned the performative humility by which scholars admit that their certainty is only as strong as their notes. A humility made easier by the fact that the notes in this case could be shown rather than evoked. Evidence does not seduce, it simply remains. In the months that followed, the college made quiet adjustments that mattered more than announcements. The caption beneath the famous photograph expanded by a single line, acknowledging the curatorial decisions that had shaped the image. The library's digital catalog added cross-references linking the mathematician's papers to committee minutes and room logs that future researchers might otherwise overlook. An orientation session for new graduate students at 9 Yomam introduced a module on reading institutional traces with care, using the chapter as a model for how to pursue truth without turning complexity into theater. The nearly omitted colleague remained wisely unnamed in public, yet the archive's restricted record now contained a neutral entry noting the existence of contextual materials deposited with care for future scholars under conditions designed to balance truth with kindness. Balance can feel like compromise to those who want victory. But Imogen had never wanted victory. She wanted the kind of justice that allows a community to stand a little straighter because it has stopped pretending to be simpler than it is. She thought often about the psychology that had made the seam in the first place, the desire to protect a legacy by polishing it into something airless, the fear that admitting any dependency would loosen admiration, the habit of converting gratitude into initials rather than names. She did not condemn those impulses because she recognized their cousin in clinical practice, where families soften hard facts to preserve the hope that keeps them steady at 3 Ors or Yet she knew, too, that hope thrives best when fed with accuracy. The student completed her thesis with a conclusion that read like a promise to future work, arguing that biography is most alive when it honors the infrastructures of attention corridors, calendars, caretakers, secretaries, the rhythm of chalk and keycards at 8 Meawam, and that such honoring enlarges the principal figure rather than diminishing him. An external examiner praised the chapter for its poise and for its refusal to trade precision for overstatement, and the degree followed in due course, marked not by ceremony alone, but by the kind of inward assent that arrives when a person sees a long labor take its final shape. There was one more task, and it belonged to Imogen not because anyone assigned it, but because her nature dislikes unfinished threads. She visited the nearly omitted colleague, at a time of day agreed by letter, 11:00 mem, in a small room that looked out over trees where the wind kept its own counsel, and she carried nothing but a thank you and the assurance that the record now had enough room to breathe. The meeting held no drama. It held instead the tender awkwardness of two people protecting a value larger than either. And when she left, she felt no triumph, only the settled warmth that comes when discretion and truth discover they can live in the same paragraph. Afterward, she walked the cloisters and thought about the graduate student's first day with a thin brief and a bright hope, about the porter's corrections that had tried to make history tidy by moving it a fraction at a time, about the printer's crop marks hunting for a boundary that would comfort the eye, about the administrators who had learned, slowly, that caution can be a companion to candor rather than its enemy. She understood anew that mysteries worth solving seldom end with a culprit. They end with a community relearning how to tell its own story. When she returned to her ordinary work, to the charts and the pulses and the small mercies that fill a nurse's day at 7:30, she carried with her the knowledge that attention is a kind of love when it insists on the whole of what is there, and that love, properly practiced, keeps people and stories from being reduced to a single flattering angle. The seam remained visible in the final account, and that visibility taught its own lesson. Strength does not require seamlessness. It requires honest stitching. Legends adjust themselves slowly when the air changes, and the air on campus carried a new clarity that did not declare itself as reform, but behaved like it, entering offices and archives at 8:30 a.m., moving quietly through mid-afternoon seminars at 3 p.m., settling into evening discussions at 7 p.m., and in that temperate weather, the work begun by a single assignment took root as practice. The biography had become both an account and a model, and models alter behavior without needing to be named as rules. The library staff began to label curated images with brief notes on selection history, not to invite suspicion, but to offer companionship to future readers who might otherwise mistake editing for innocence. The archive drafted a small guide that explained how peripheral records, maintenance tickets, key logs, Porter annotations could corroborate narratives when memories were tired, and the guide recommended patience as method, a word that, when introduced at 9:15 a.m., seemed to decelerate discussion just enough to let detail rise. The graduate student, now a scholar among colleagues, used the chapter as a cornerstone for a broader study of how collaboration hides in plain sight across disciplines that reward solitude, and that study, begun at 11:00 a.m. with a blank page and the hard-won courage to write without apology, demonstrated that the psychology of admiration improves when it is given more than one person to admire. Admiration dispersed is not admiration diluted. It is admiration made breathable. Resistance did not cease. It softened into the manageable discomfort of adjustment. An alumni event at 6:00 p.m. asked for reassurance that donors would not feel betrayed by context, and reassurance arrived not as assurance, but as demonstration. The framed photograph kept its dignified place, while a small placard beneath it added 2 sentences about curation and companionship, and visitors who paused to read seemed to stand a fraction taller, as if released from the performance of pretending that perfection is the only condition worthy of respect. A columnist tried again to provoke appetite with insinuation, arranging words at 1:00 piece, as if a pattern of consultation must imply scandal, and the piece briefly agitated those who favor theater. Yet the agitation met the ballast of steady narrative, and found nothing to grip. Steadiness is not a mood, it is a technique. Imogen noticed that technique diffusing into how people spoke about their own work. A chemist described a breakthrough by placing the lab manager's timing sense beside the principal investigator's vision. A historian credited the cataloger who had recognized a mislabeled box at 10:45 a.m. and prevented a thesis from wandering into error. A tutor spoke with unembarrassed gratitude about a colleague who read drafts at 7 a.m. before the day could crowd thinking out of its own house. What had begun as a seam in a famous life became a way to read seams everywhere, not as flaws, but as the evidence of honest stitching. The nearly omitted colleague remained properly peripheral, an arrangement that honored both contribution and privacy, and the archive's restricted note provided enough light for future scholars to recognize where to stand without inviting a spotlight that would force someone into a role they had declined. That decision became a precedent, and precedents, when quiet and sensible, endure. Imogen's own days returned to their familiar cadence, yet the case had left her with a renewed sense that attention is most powerful when it refuses both outrage and indifference. Outrage escalates noise until nuance cannot survive. Indifference smooths every surface until nothing can catch. She kept a private ledger of the small mercies the investigation had revealed the retired secretary's drawer that refused to forget. The porter's corrections that had meant only to help and had helped after all, the anonymous envelope that had trusted the student with a fragment of truth and had been met with care rather than hunger. Those mercies added up to a piece of justice that felt proportional, the kind that does not humiliate anyone and yet refuses to let a simplification stand where a life had been lived in depth. One afternoon at 4:30 p.m., she attended a reading group where students compared the chapter to other biographies and found themselves noticing what those books left unacknowledged the hands that had held ladders. The co-authors erased by custom rather than by design, the timetables that revealed nightly collaboration even when the prefaces remained politely evasive. Their conversation tilted toward hope, the precise emotion that realism, properly practiced, often produces. Hope rooted in accuracy does not fear complexity. A term later, the college approved a small exhibition on method to run in a hallway where foot traffic allowed for serendipitous learning at 12 Zorav by mm, or 2 Zorav by mm, or whatever hour the day could spare, and the exhibition presented ordinary documents without gloss booking sheets, maintenance slips, cropping proofs, each paired with a short card explaining how such modest traces help stories resist drift. Visitors lingered for the unexpected pleasure of feeling that truth can be both demanding and kind. The graduate student, invited to write the wall text, chose sentences that matched the chapter's temperament, giving readers the dignity of inference rather than the seduction of certainty, packaged as revelation. A reviewer arriving at 5 Hudursassur p.m., expecting controversy, found instead a calm argument for better seeing and wrote, to their credit, that the absence of spectacle was the point. In the quiet that followed, Imogen considered what had changed in herself. The case had not made her more suspicious. It had made her more curious about the architecture of trust. Trust, she decided, is built from precisely the elements the chapter had honored: timelines that do not fear correction, photographs that admit their frames, institutions that allow their pride to include the people who make reliability possible at 8:30 m and 6:30 m. Individuals who accept that being lifted is not the same as being diminished. She carried that conclusion back into the ward and into the college and into the small routines that keep both alive, knowing that routines are where values choose to live when speeches are over. The seam, still visible in the final account, no longer signified fracture. It signified a choice to prefer honest texture to sterile polish. And once seen, that choice made other choices easier. It was not a lesson about a single mathematician or a single college. It was a lesson about how communities survive their own legends by telling stories that can hold everyone who truly did the work. Seasons turned without ceremony, and the chapter's influence settled into habits rather than proclamations, the kind of change that becomes visible only when a person pauses at 8:10 p.m. and notices that a notice board now pairs photographs with the briefest account of how each image was shaped, or when a faculty meeting at 2:40 p.m. pauses long enough to let a facility's note about room bookings inform the way a case study is understood. The graduate student, now teaching with the steadiness that comes from building a thing brick by brick, found that students leaned closer when invited to trace institutional weather instead of chasing thunder. And the room's mood altered accordingly. Less appetite for spectacle, more appetite for the dependable pleasures of clarity. In that climate, the biography's insight began to propagate as a method rather than a conclusion, traveling from a hallway exhibition to a departmental workshop, from a modest blog post to a reading group that met punctually at 5:30 p.m. and left with the quiet excitement that follows the discovery that ordinary documents contain more adventure than rumor ever will. Change always meets its countercurrent, and it arrived in the familiar form of efficiency masking as improvement. A proposal circulated at 9000 a.m. to streamline archives by deaccessioning materials deemed peripheral to principal collections, and the rationale praised focus while endangering context. Imogen recognized the psychology at once, that tidy impulse that confuses sharpness with truth, and she responded not with alarm, but with demonstration, assembling a short dossier by noon that showed how Porter annotations, maintenance slips, and crop proofs had served as the scaffolding for a chapter now praised for its reliability. The dossier did not scold or dramatize. It simply made it difficult for reasonable minds to claim that peripheral meant dispensable. The committee revised the proposal by 4:15 p.m., preserving the small traces that make large stories honest. And the revision arrived with a tone that admitted learning without the discomfort of public repentance. The nearly omitted colleague remained a quiet constant at the edge of things, and Imogen kept a respectful distance anchored by occasional notes at 11:20 a.m. that conveyed gratitude without asking for more. She understood that dignity often lives in the decision not to make a private life carry the weight of an institution's late honesty. The mathematician's legacy, freed from the brittleness of solitary myth, began to feel more alive in conversation, not because the work had changed, but because the story around it had room for the air of relation. Students writing papers at 8:50 p.m. no longer needed to twist themselves into admiration. They could admire with relief, recognizing in the record a pattern that matched what their own best hours of thought felt like when shared. Imogen continued to translate method into care, which is the deepest translation she knew. She mentored a new cohort of researchers across disciplines in a seminar that began at 7:45 a.m., inviting them to build timelines that could tolerate correction, to read photographs as arguments shaped by frames, to treat institutional routines as living witnesses rather than bureaucratic noise. The seminar's promise was modest and therefore sturdy. If you learn to see how a place supports thought, you will learn to see how thought supports people. And if you learn that, you will write stories that can be trusted, even when they make comfort work a little harder. Trust, once cultivated, began to repay the college in small dividends that mattered. A donation at 3:30 p.m., specified funds for the preservation of routine records, a fellowship at 1:10 p.m., rewarded meticulous contextual research, a catalog update at 10:05 a.m., linked related collections by the paths readers actually walk rather than by the formal categories they inherit. There were misreadings along the way. A commentator outside the college tried to turn the expanded narrative into a parable about decay, as if naming companionship must imply decline. And for a week the argument created ripples at 6 heures P. Croissant, among those who had not yet made peace with the idea that respect grows stronger as it becomes more precise. The ripples passed when the chapter was taught at 9:35. Wemham, beside a selection of original documents and the simplicity of correspondence between claim and trace, quieted appetite for controversy. In that classroom, a student noticed that certainty felt less brittle when it could point calmly to the margin where initials recorded an act of care, and the student wrote later that the lesson transformed how they read everything, including themselves. Imogen kept hold of the first principle that had guided her through the seam: attention is a form of love that refuses both flattery and neglect. She used it again when a promising researcher at 2:20 p.m. confessed a creeping hurry that threatened to sand nuance out of a project for the sake of a deadline. She offered the researcher an hour at 8:00 a.m. the next day, and in that hour they discovered that the pace of accuracy is not slow, it is exact, and exactness, once found, saves more time than haste ever does because it prevents the expensive repairs that follow after a spectacular shortcut. The researcher left with a timetable that included breath, and the breath restored the project's intelligence. What began as a biography had by now taught the college how to be biographical about itself, how to narrate processes without embarrassment, how to admit frames without fearing that frames diminish what they present. The photograph that had once been an icon became a case study, not dethroned but contextualized, and visitors who paused at 4:50 p.m. to read the expanded caption often lingered to consider the pleasure of seeing the craft that makes admiration possible. The pleasure turned out to be contagious, and it altered how events were remembered across departments, so that in the year's final gathering at 6:30 p.m., speeches included the names of those who had arranged the rooms, kept the calendars, and corrected the small errors that would have become large if left alone. Imogen walked home at 7:15 p.m., under a sky with the clean light that makes edges honest, and she understood that the seam's visibility had become the point, a reminder that strong fabric shows its stitching. She thought about the graduate student who had been brave enough to keep asking for particulars when vague praise would have been easier. About the invisible hands that had steadied the record without craving credit. About the institution that had learned slowly to prefer texture to varnish. The lesson felt portable, serviceable, and gently demanding, the kind that can move from a college corridor to a kitchen table, from a ward at 5:10 a.m. to a research office at 2:55 p.m. Wherever humans choose stories that keep them honest enough to trust one another. Winter folded into spring with modest certainty, and by 8:30 a.m. on an ordinary weekday, the college moved in a rhythm that felt cleaner for having learned the difference between polish and care, a difference that does not announce itself but changes how eyes travel over shelves and how hands pause before a box to read its label with respect. The exhibition on method was still in place, though its cards had grown softer at the corners from so many fingertips, and a quiet current of gratitude had replaced the old habit of defensiveness. The biography sat on a reading room table where students arrived at 10:15 a.m., wrote notes in patient handwriting, and let the ordinary machinery of proof teach them how stories hold together when attention refuses shortcuts. The graduate student, now carrying the steadiness of someone who has seen a careful idea survive the weather, scheduled her hours so that generosity would not be sacrificed to speed, leaving room at 7:45 a.m. for unhurried reading and at 5:20 p.m. for conversations that made drafts braver rather than louder. Imogen kept her own hours with the same discipline, one eye on the wards where accuracy saves lives, one eye on the halls where accuracy saves reputations from the fragility of myth, and somewhere between those attentions a practice emerged that felt like a vocation made visible. The nearly omitted colleague remained part of the air rather than the stage, and the archive's restricted entry existed like a simple truth that needed no ornament, signposted with discretion, so future scholars would not mistake kindness for secrecy. The photograph continued to look out from its frame, dignified in its honest caption, the crop no longer a trick, but a declared choice. And those who paused at 3:40 p.m. to read the added lines found themselves released from the performance of idealization into the lighter work of respect. The college adopted the habit of narrating the scaffolding of success alongside the heights, a habit that traveled from committee minutes to conference introductions and even into the soft rituals of gratitude at 6:00 p.m. Gatherings where people who used to linger at the margins now stood a little nearer the center without feeling exposed. That small drift toward fairness had the physiological feel of a breath held too long finally being released. Imogen understood that the heart of the matter had never been scandal and had never required confession. The heart was the psychology of how groups remember, the way hunger for simple stories can become a fear of the complex ones that are already true, by refusing fear, by preferring precision to theater. The chapter had taught a community to admire without pretending that admiration must be airless. It also taught a subtler skill how to end without erasing. Endings in institutions often arrive as closures, but this ending behaved like an opening. A door left ajar so fresh correction could enter without triggering alarms. It had taken months to learn that courage can be quiet, that the strongest argument is the one that remains calm at 2:10 p.m. When voices begin to climb, that kindness to sources does not require flattery, that care for the living can coexist with accuracy about the dead, that a seam does not weaken fabric when it is stitched with honest thread. On a late afternoon, 4:55 p.m., Imogen passed the cloister where the visitor board still recorded the day's arrivals with the same clean hand that once hid small shifts inside larger courtesies, and she felt a companionable tenderness toward the human need to straighten what will not naturally lie flat. She did not condemn the need. She had only learned to ask it for better reasons. She walked to the river, stood where the water throws back a sky that has learned all colors, and let the case settle into its final shape, a piece of justice earned not by exposure, but by calibration, a measure adjusted until the scale could be trusted again. The lesson traveled easily beyond the stones. It fit into kitchens where families try to remember fairly, into studios where credit must be portioned with care, into workplaces where the early hour of the morning belongs to those who prepare the day so others can perform inside it. It offered itself to anyone who has ever loved a legend and then loved it better after it became human. Imogen returned home at 7:20 p.m. with the fatigue that follows worthwhile clarity and set down her bag with the ordinary satisfaction of a day used well. She reviewed the notes she would give to the next student who asked how to hold a complicated truth without breaking it, and they arranged themselves into something more durable than advice attend to what is small. Let documents protect your memory, treat photographs as arguments, hold names with care, and understand that accuracy is not an instrument of punishment, but a practice of love. The call to the audience, if one were to be made, would be simple and shaped like the work itself. If this story widened your sense of what justice looks like when it is patient, help it reach someone who still believes that honesty must bruise to be real. Tap the like so the algorithm learns to reward nuance. Share with a friend who loves mysteries made of ordinary traces. Subscribe if you want more true stories told with calm intensity. And leave a comment about a time you saw quiet care make a hard thing easier to face.